the way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay?
Come on.
You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
Take a son to school.
About 7:30 a.m., I faintly heard a young female saying, "Help me."
Lisa Johnson was the first person to encounter the woman and to help rescue her. She told the Excelsior Citizen the woman was nearly naked as she pleaded for help.
It was actually like an S&M dress. It was plastic, black plastic, very short. It wasn't shorts, it was a dress. That's all she had on. And the duct tape around her neck and the collar. And it was restricted. It was a metal collar. It looked like a shot collar, a homemade one at that. I seen her wrists were pretty messed up and her ankles. Asked what she needed. It was obvious. I didn't really have to ask at that point. I just started looking. First thing I did was tell her I was calling the police. That kind of agitated her. She told her that if I called the police, that he would kill both of us if he found out. She said he already killed her two friends that she was with.
The woman who escaped said other Black women were killed by her abductor. She's not spoken publicly. She's not been named, but she helped break open a story that the Kansas City police had vehemently denied, as community members raised alarm that Black women and girls were being disappeared in September, possibly by a serial killer. Police responded by saying the reports were, quote, completely unfounded. Some of the concerns were raised in a now viral video by Bishop Tony Caldwell of Eternal Life Church by the independent publication, the Kansas City Defender.
I am a little upset right now. The reason I'm upset is because we got 4 young ladies that have been murdered within the last week here off of 85th and Prospect. We got a serial killer again, and ain't nobody saying nothing. The media's not covering it. We got 3 young ladies that are missing. Ain't nobody saying a word. What is the problem? Why can't we get some cooperation? Where's our community leaders? Where's our activists? Where's our public officials? Where's our police department? Where is those folks at? In President Gardens. Come on now. We need to start knocking doors. We need to start making sure that this is brought to the light. We cannot continue to let this happen.
After that video went viral in September, the Kansas City Police Department spokesperson insisted there was, quote, no basis to support this rumor, unquote. But police have since arrested 39-year-old Timothy Haslett in Excelsior Springs, Missouri, for kidnapping and torturing the woman who escaped. The Kansas City Defender has reported on his social media posts saying they show the sexual predator was, quote, a white supremacist who believed we are in a race war. For more, we're joined in Kansas City by two guests, Ryan Sorrell, founder of the Black-led independent newspaper, The Kansas City Defender, and Justice Gatson, executive director of the Real Justice Network, a Black woman-led organization based in Kansas City, Missouri. Welcome you both to Democracy Now! I mean, Ryan, your Black-led independent newspaper has been leading the charge on this as the police department adamantly denied there was any issue until this woman escaped with chains. Can you take us through this story? And not only her story, but she said to the woman who helped her that her friends were killed.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is one of the most horrific tragedies that I have ever.
Welcome, everyone. And I don't know why I have the midterm up. All right, I must be tired. If you haven't actually seen that, go right to our channel, Min-Mass Media Group. Check out our Midterm Madness show. We're actually going to be doing another one this Sunday. Check us out. Check us out there. Follow up. Actually, in the Mass Media Group, we had a meeting today with the OMB, Office of Management Bureau, I think that's what they're called. Man, I can't remember. But yeah, Kim and I were did a presentation with them in regards to like the census, disaggregation, data disaggregation, and so forth. So yeah, we had about a 10 to 12 minute presentation. Technically, our presentation could have been like at least 20 to 30 minutes. We also shared our time with the sister out in Louisiana. Let's see if we can actually reach out to that sister. Maybe we can actually do both of our presentations here on In the Mass Media Group to let the family know what that's about. Now, if you're not familiar with the OMB, do your research on it. I believe, if I'm correct, they're the ones who actually disseminate the census and categorize persons here in the United States according to race and ethnicity. So yeah, we're going to continue on with chapter 12. And I'm pulling it up as we speak. Yeah, it's really unfortunate. I don't know if anybody in the chat or for those who are going to be listening to this heard the story about that unfortunate situation in Kansas City. Once again, ignoring American freedmen and our plight, and especially when it comes to telling our truths. Because Black people, even an independent, shout out to the independent Black media, was trying to tell the police and other quote unquote major media that, look, There's something going on. We need your help. But once again, neglect, right? It is tragic. But we're going to try to keep our heads up, keep it moving, keep it pushing. Because without our ancestors, we would not be here today. All right, family. So we're once again on chapter 12. And let me scroll down to where we need to be. Let's see. Medical therapies, no. Mental health. Here we go. And impact of anti-Black racism on Black mental health. I think that's where we started. Yeah. That's where we ended up. 424. Yeah, I mean, this is all traumatic. I mean, that story's, traumatic. I think we talked about it, yesterday. Yeah, shout out to Darlene. Thanks for coming through, family. Definitely heartbreaking, family. Whew. Yes, welcome, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. It's about to be another informative chapter. Not only in reading, but in our lives. This is another chapter that we're going into in America. Hopefully it's progressive, so we can help heal the history, the present, and the future of American freedom and people. So let's get busy. Impact of anti-Black racism on Black mental health. For centuries, nearly every institution of the Western world has explicitly and implicitly reinforced the message that African Americans are to be devalued. Within this context, it is inevitable that African American mental health and well-being has suffered. The psychic effects of this anti-Black narrative include cultural trauma, cultural imperialism, and internalized racism. Cultural trauma is a dramatic loss of identity and meaning, a tear in the social fabric affecting a group of people. The overwhelming amount of racial stress caused by racism can result in trauma. Racial trauma, a form of race-based stress, is defined by psychologists as a persistent psychological injury caused by racism. All right, fam, I'm going to pause it there just real quick, and I will be right back. All right, let's do this. The overwhelming amount of racial stress caused by racism can result in trauma. Racial trauma, a form of race-based stress, is defined by psychologists as persistent psychological injury caused by racism. This trauma may produce mental illnesses or psychological wounds tied to historical traumatic experiences, like slavery. Studies have shown that racial and ethnic discrimination may play an important role in the development of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, for Black people. Racial trauma can cause symptoms similar to PTSD, including hypervigilance, flashbacks, nightmares, avoidance, suspiciousness, and physical symptoms such as headaches, heart palpitations, and other such symptoms. Studies have also shown that public racial discrimination against African Americans is linked to an increase in depressive symptoms. Historical trauma is a legacy of numerous traumatic events inflicted on a group of people and experienced over generations. The health consequences of historical racism and discrimination can be passed down psychologically, socially, and emotionally from one generation to the next, resulting in intergenerational harm to Black mental health due to racism. Long-term adverse health impacts linked to legal segregation laws illustrate the long reach of institutional racism. Historical trauma studies show that children of Black parents who have been affected by trauma also exhibit symptoms of PTSD, or historical trauma response. Traumatization can occur at a community level as well. Highly publicized police killings of unarmed African Americans affect the mental health of African Americans in the region where the killing occurs. In one study, the impact was felt for months afterwards, whereas no negative effects were found for white Americans in those same localities. A 2013-2016 study, or 2013 to 2016 study, on the mental impacts of killings of African Americans in certain states found that African Americans had more poor mental health days, whereas white people were not affected in the same way. California. Psychological institutions have contributed to over-incarceration, forced sterilization, and denial of educational opportunities for Black Californians. In 1915, psychologists leading the California Bureau of Juvenile Research at Whittier State School oversaw some of the earliest eugenics projects, examining family trees and conducting psychological testing of boys confined at the institution. The results of this project harmed Black youth in California by increasing incarceration rates and promoting sterilization. Psychological tests were used by the state's public education system to block educational and economic opportunities for Black youth in California. In 1979, the Federal District Court of Northern California ruled in favor of 5 Black students who had been placed in special education classes due to their performance on psychological tests. The mental health system in California has discriminated against Black Californians through inaccurate diagnoses, use of involuntary force, high cost, and a lack of cultural competent services. In comparison to other racial and ethnic groups, it takes longer for Black Californians to be removed from inpatient mental health care settings to a less restrictive level of care. Despite higher rates of inpatient treatment, over 50% of Black Californians must wait more than 8 days to step down from an inpatient setting to a lower level of care. It takes twice as long for Black Californians than it does for most other racial or ethnic groups. Despite no evidence of less need, these racial disparities also exist in California's small counties, despite fewer numbers of people from non-white communities. Many Black Californians suffer from high rates of serious psychological distress, depression, suicidal ideation, dual diagnoses, and other mental health issues. Unmet mental health needs are higher among Black Californians as compared with white Californians. Right. Okay. This includes being unable to access mental health care and substance abuse services. Across racial groups, the highest percentage of serious psychological distress and attempted suicide was found among Black Californians. Black Californians had the highest percentage of missed days of school, missed days of work, and daily activities due to mental health concerns. Black people are overrepresented in vulnerable groups at risk for mental illness, such as unhoused people, current and formerly incarcerated people, children in foster care, and veterans. These groups have an increased risk for developing post-traumatic stress disorder. California budget cuts and funding for indigent care have disproportionately affected Black communities, who are more likely to be indigent and in need of mental health services. The lack of recruitment and retention of Black psychiatrists in Los Angeles has negatively affected Black Californians, who are more likely to seek services from someone with the same racial background. I don't know if I mentioned this in the last interjection. I don't know if I mentioned in this last read, but if for those who advocate for reparations, and specifically those who are looking to resurrect the Freedmen's Bureau, or I can't remember, Freedmen Affairs Bureau, Office of Affairs, or something like that, definitely need a mental health section for sure. Yeah, we definitely need to get our freedmen psychologists going again, and support that system, because we definitely need some mental health support. Let's continue. Black mentally ill incarcerated Californians are overrepresented in Los Angeles County jails. Records indicate that they receive more mental health services while incarcerated than while they are out in the community, which is illustrative of how poor community mental health services are for Black Californians. Black Californians represent only 11% of Alameda County's population, but make up 47% of the county's unhoused population. I'm going to repeat that again. Black Californians represent only 11% of Alameda County's population, but make up 47% of the county's unhoused population. 48% of the jail system's population and 53% of people who cycle in and out of both the criminal and hospital systems. The state of California has repeatedly awarded state and county contracts to agencies that continually fail to meet a minimum level of culturally relevant care for African Americans. Reproductive and gender identity responsive health. The federal and state governments have historically policed the childbearing practices of African American women and denied reproductive rights in healthcare. Black women have been used as tools of reproduction for capitalist profit or forcibly sterilized and denied reproductive freedom. Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and LGBTQ Americans are less likely to access healthcare. As a result, Black women and LGBTQ Americans have suffered in part due to the legacy of enslavement. Black women were denied autonomy over their reproduction during the slavery era and denied their rights as mothers. State and federal governments forcibly sterilized Black women in 19th and 20th centuries. Later, state policies included plans to distribute experimental birth control like Norplant in Black communities. States criminalized and sterilized Black women for giving birth if traces of controlled substances were found in them or their babies. Coercive welfare policies mandated long-term contraceptive insertion with harmful health consequences as a condition for receiving welfare benefits. Historically, state and federal governments have refused to subsidize reproductive care, such as abortion for poor women. This especially harms Black women's access to reproductive care. Black women rely on publicly funded clinics in higher numbers due to lack of access to private health insurance or income for a private physician. Black women are also less likely to have access to information about informed consent, sterilization, and side effects of contraceptives. Forced sterilization, mentioned earlier, was used in conjunction with these policies to deny Black women autonomy over their own bodies and their reproductive health. Studies show that Black women suffer from disproportionate infertility in comparison to other groups. This disparity stems from untreated sexually transmitted infections, nutritional deficiencies, complications from childbirth and abortion, and environmental hazards. Black women are treated as infertile by doctors who underdiagnose endometriosis in Black women. Many reproductive technologies are unaffordable or inaccessible to Black women experiencing fertility issues. One of the most harmful legacies of slavery is the disproportionate maternal and infant death of Black women and children today due to lack of access to adequate reproductive health care. Black women experience disproportionate racial discrimination in access to and quality of prenatal care. Expecting and new Black mothers often find that their reports of painful symptoms are overlooked or minimized by medical practitioners. Black women must wait longer for prenatal appointments and are ignored, scolded, demeaned, and bullied into having C-sections. Even wealthier Black women suffer the racist disregard of mental providers. Serena Williams, the renowned tennis champion, was ignored by medical providers who dismissed her concern regarding a post-pregnancy blood clot. Wow. After insistence by Williams that she undergo a CT scan, doctors found a clot in her lungs. Oh my God. Wow. Black women disproportionately experience adverse birth outcomes and adverse maternal health. Researchers have found evidence that this may be influenced by the uniquely high level of racism-induced stress experienced by Black women. As discussed above, structural racism is a stressor that harms Black women at both psychological and genetic levels. Structural racism contributes to maternal and infant death disparities. In the United States, pregnancy-related mortality is 3 to 4 times higher among Black women than among white women. Adequate prenatal care does not reduce racial disparities for African American women, who are still at an elevated risk for preterm birth. Hypertension, which has been linked to the stress of living in a racist society, contributes to racial disparities in pregnancy-related complications such as eclampsia. Black mothers are less likely to breastfeed their babies than white mothers due to numerous historical factors, including predatory marketing practices. Lower breastfeeding rates are associated with higher risk of medical issues before and after childbirth and maternal mental health issues. Health of Black LGBTQ Americans. Black lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer Americans experience discrimination in healthcare. They are also more likely to be uninsured. For Black transgender Americans, this results in difficulties in seeing healthcare providers and receiving gender-affirming care due to costs. Studies have indicated that Black LGBTQ Americans experience asymptoms, judgment, stigma, and discrimination in the healthcare system. It is difficult for them to establish a personal bond, trust, and familiarity with providers, who do not often meet their needs with respect to their sexual and gender identities. Black LGBTQ Americans suffer from especially poor health outcomes. Black LGBTQ people who identify as women have higher diagnoses of hypertension, stroke, and diabetes. Many Black LGBTQ Americans are at higher risk for HIV when compared with white, cisgender, heterosexual Americans. As of 2015, Black transgender women had HIV at the rate of 19%, while 1.4% of the transgender population at large had HIV. Black LGBTQ Americans have also been found to have higher rates of asthma, heart attacks, and cancer. A large portion of the Black LGBTQ Americans have suffered verbal insults or abuse, threats of violence, physical or sexual assault, and robbery or property destruction. Black LGBTQ Americans are almost twice as likely to report a diagnosis of depression compared to African American non-LGBTQ adults. Researchers posit that such mental and physical health outcomes are linked to a combination of anti-Black racial discrimination, and anti-LGBTQ prejudice. Stigma and discrimination can create a stressful social environment that may lead to mental and physical health problems for African Americans in the LGBTQ community. In California, as well as nationally, Black women are substantially more likely than white women to suffer severe health complications during pregnancy, give premature birth, die in childbirth, and lose their babies. From 2014 to 2016, the pregnancy-related mortality ratio for Black women in California was 4 to 6 times greater than the mortality ratio for other ethnic groups. In fact, Black women were overrepresented for pregnancy-related deaths for all causes, but most notably for deaths during pregnancy or during hospitalization post-delivery. Over the past decade, Black babies died at almost 5 times the rate of white babies in San Francisco. Ashe to all the babies. In a comprehensive studies of 1.8 million hospital births, it was found that when a Black doctor is the primary charge on these cases, the infant mortality rate is cut in half. The high rates of preterm birth and maternal mortality for Black women are due in part to complications from underestimated or undiagnosed health conditions. In 2006, in Los Angeles, Betty Jean Ford gave preterm birth to a baby who did not survive. 0.548. Giving birth was horrible, she said. It was just an awful experience emotionally, physically. Black people giving birth experience the highest rates of postpartum depression and mortality during childbirth. California passed the Dignity in Pregnancy and Childbirth Act in 2019, which aims to address implicit bias in healthcare and collect data on maternal health. However, experts state that the bill is difficult to enforce, since physicians contract with hospitals and are not subject to the same oversight as ordinary employees. It is left to healthcare facilities to implement practices to address implicit bias, which is not likely to occur. A survey in California found that Black women disproportionately report unfair treatment, harsh language, and rough handling during their hospital stay as compared to white women. Doulas are trained professionals who provide physical, emotional, and informational support to mothers. Evidence shows that women who had the support of doulas were less likely to have C-sections and have healthier babies. Doulas play an important role as advocates for Black women in the medical system when medical providers do not believe Black women or address their needs. However, during the C-19 pandemic, the California State Legislature failed to pass an initiative to provide doula care for pregnant and postpartum people in the 14 California counties with the highest birth disparities. In the American West, Black LGBTQ Americans are more likely to be insured, diagnosed with depression, and diagnosed with that. Okay, no, sorry, I've already read that. Child and youth health. Some scholars have stated that the legacy of slavery and the segregation and racial terror that occurred in the years after has resulted in high rates of infant mortality and damaged health. Discriminatory care has continued through the centuries, resulting in lasting health disparities affecting Black children and youth. As will be discussed in this section, the public school, foster care, and carceral systems further damage the health of Black youth due to the discriminatory and violent treatment Black youth receive at the hands of state and local officials. Pediatric care. Racial desegregation in hospitals has resulted in lower quality care for Black babies, contributing in part to low birth weight and premature birth for Black infants. The infant death rate for Black babies is the highest in the nation. Black infants are Black infants are twice as likely to die as white infants. 11.3 per 1,000 Black babies die compared with 4.9 per 1,000 white babies. This racial disparity is wider than that of 1850, when African Americans were enslaved. Studies show that education does not mitigate this problem. Black women with advanced degrees are more likely to lose their babies than white women, with less than an 8th grade education. Federal and state governments have not addressed this problem, since, as of March 2022, only 9 states investigate racial disparities when conducting reviews of pregnancy-related deaths. Wow. Racial disparities in infant mortality and low birth weight have been associated with racial discrimination in maternal stress. Studies show that Black physician care of Black newborns significantly reduces the Black infant death rate. However, Black physicians are disproportionately underrepresented in the field of medicine. The American Academy of Pediatrics has stated that racism is a social determinant of health care, which has a profound impact on the health of children. African American children experience worse health outcomes than white American children due to unequal access to care, in part because of parental unemployment and lower household net worth. For a more detailed discussion of wealth disparities, please see Chapter 13 on the wealth gap. The impact of racism has been linked to birth disparities in health problems in Black children and adolescents. Chronic stress leads to increased and prolonged levels of exposure to stress hormones, which lead to inflammatory reactions that predispose children to chronic diseases. Increased stress related to racial discrimination experienced by Black children has been associated with increased asthma risk and severity. African American children are more likely to die from asthma. Children's exposure to discrimination has also been linked with higher rates of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, anxiety, depression, and decreased general health. Black youth disproportionately suffer from obesity and being overweight due to social and environmental circumstances that produce psychological stress, including less access to education and more exposure to racial discrimination. Black children are referred less likely for kidney transplants than white children. They are also more likely to die following surgery. The underdiagnosing of Black children is linked to the lack of Black pediatricians, which has resulted in inadequate access to pediatric care for Black children. School, foster care, and carceral systems. Black youth are overrepresented in the foster care system and suffer disproportionately worse health outcomes in the system. Black youth suffer from greater rates of child abuse and neglect, as well as negative impacts on mental health in state-run foster care systems. They may be placed on psychotropic drugs, which alter behavior patterns and increase the risk of suicide and illness. Black students experience disparate health outcomes and discrimination in public school systems. Racial disparities in educational access and attainment, along with racism experienced in schools. Blow this up a little bit. Let's see. Affect the trajectory of academic achievement for Black youth and ultimately harm their health. For a more detailed discussion of discrimination in education, please see Chapter 6 on separate and unequal education. Black students are 2.9 times more likely to be labeled with a disability than white students, resulting in a disproportionate placement of Black students in special education, where they are less likely than white students to return to regular instruction and are prescribed unnecessary psychotropic medications. In public schools, despite health screenings and low academic scores that indicate mental illness, a learning disability, or developmental delay, Black youth are overdiagnosed for conduct disorder and underdiagnosed for depression. The closure of public schools during the C-19 pandemic resulted in missed meals, negatively impacted Black children's health, nutrition, and food security because Black students are more likely to be eligible for free or reduced price meals. Oh man. Black youth are overrepresented at every level of the juvenile justice system, from initial contact with law enforcement to sentencing and incarceration, which has led to worsening health. Among youth who are arrested, Black youth are 3 times as likely to be incarcerated in the juvenile justice system and less likely to be diverted to non-carceral settings than white youth. African American youth involved in the carceral system have worse mental and physical health during and after incarceration. This is due to communicable diseases which spread in juvenile facilities, physical and sexual trauma, as well as erosion of mental health. Black youth are overprescribed psychotropic medication and diagnosed by the carceral system when compared with white youth. Within juvenile justice settings, African American boys are 40% more likely to be diagnosed with conduct disorder than white youth, while African American girls are 54% more likely, even when controlling for trauma, behavioral indicators, and criminal offense charges. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. California. Malnutrition rates are higher for Black children in California when compared with other racial groups. For instance, 20.2% of Black California households reported having children who did not have enough to eat, which is higher than the 15.9% of all California households that reported not having enough food to eat. According to data from 2018, almost 3 times as many Black California children live in poverty when compared with white children. Poverty results in worse cognitive, socio-emotional, and physical health. This is particularly prevalent for Black children in California due to their overrepresentation among poor children at large. In California, Black youth are more likely to be incarcerated than their white peers and have likely had prior exposure to toxic stress. The poor living conditions among incarcerated youth intensify health problems. The carceral system inadequately serves the health needs of Black incarcerated youth. Tanisha Denard, a Black teenager, was in high school when she violated her probation due to unpaid truancy tickets and was sent to juvenile hall. Her time in juvenile hall severely harmed her mental health. Being locked down make you feel that you are worthless to society, she said. You start to think about any way to escape, even if it means suicide. While incarcerated, she was subjected to solitary confinement, not allowed to use the restroom, and forced to sleep on bed sheets stained with urine, blood, and feces. The juvenile justice system lacks policies, practices, and interventions specific to serving Black youth like Denard. Public health crisis. Scholars have theorized that the federal and state government's racist public health practices, along with centuries of slavery, segregation, and white oppression, have resulted in entrenched systemic racism, which has harmed African American health. The public health crises described in this section are not an exhaustive list of the mismanagement of health crises. Rather, they are selected illustrative examples. Today, African Americans continue to be at the highest risk of or for negative health impacts or public health crisis. Infectious diseases. In 1793, anti-Black racism on the part of state officials in Pennsylvania resulted in the death of hundreds of African Americans during the yellow fever epidemic. At the time, medical historians and prominent white leaders, assuming Black people were immune to the disease, encouraged African Americans to assist with managing the epidemic. Many black residents remained in the city instead of fleeing, participating in the epidemic relief effort, caring for the ill, and burying the dead. Ashe to them, brothers and sisters. In the end, hundreds of African Americans died from yellow fever. Ashe. In the post-Reconstruction era, tuberculosis was a deadly death problem for African Americans. In 1900, there were large disparities in tuberculosis rates between white and black populations because segregated black neighborhoods were impoverished, had congested housing, and could not access basic healthcare information. In the early 1900s, state and local public health agencies, hospitals, and physicians portrayed black people as a hazardous population to the white public. In 1964, black tuberculosis rates were 2 to 3 times higher than for white Americans. Substandard and segregated housing, in addition to concentrated poverty, contributed to high HIV and tuberculosis rates in the 1980s and 1990s. The disease spread widely in persons, hospitals, cramped housing, and homeless shelters, leading tuberculosis rates to increase among African Americans. Due to a combination of government neglect and systemic racism, African Americans have been harmed by the spread of infectious diseases. All right, drug addiction. Internationally, public health officials have recognized that drug addiction should be treated as a health disorder and not a criminal behavior. The federal government has chosen to respond to rising drug addiction as a criminal justice issue instead of as a public health issue. This has resulted in state action against black people in need of substance abuse services. According to healthcare providers and experts, the government should treat drug addiction as a public health issue. Drug addiction is a medical condition, not a flaw in character. Punishment for substance abuse disorders does not treat addiction. It leads to higher risk of drug overdose. By the 1980s, the government embarked upon a rigorous crackdown on the usage of crack, a crystallized type of cocaine which is highly addictive and relatively cheap. During the 1970s, hospital emergency rooms began testing pregnant women for suspected drug use and reporting them to police authorities. In many cases, hospitals imprisoned women, shackled them while they gave birth, or took temporary or permanent custody of their children. Oh my gosh. Hospitals reported black pregnant women 10 times more frequently to government health and authorities than white women. HIV/AIDS. During the 1980s, AIDS harmed black communities severely, especially LGBTQ, black populations, and intravenous black drug users who were overrepresented among AIDS victims. Today, the prevalence of HIV is especially high within the African American LGBTQ community. Black, gay, and bisexual men are infected by HIV more than any other group in the United States today and have the highest HIV death rate. Between 2010 and 2019, the number of HIV infections among white gay men decreased significantly, while the number of infections among African American gay men did not increase. Long-standing inequities in access to and delivery of health care to African Americans has led to this disparity. Black women accounted for the largest share of women living with an HIV diagnosis in 2017. Due to the lack of federal or state-funded healthcare resources for the AIDS epidemic, Black healthcare leaders and organizers work to connect AIDS victims to medical services, benefits, and health education. Black and community organizations formed to educate African Americans about sexual health and AIDS prevention. They worked with Black LGBTQ populations to educate them about safe sex practices and to provide outreach and healthcare services to people with AIDS. Despite this work by African American communities, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention plan to cut funding from dozens of groups operating aid services. Nutrition. African Americans are more likely to live in food deserts, areas with limited access to healthy, affordable food. For more detailed discussion of discrimination in infrastructure, please see Chapter 7 on Racism in Environment and Infrastructure. Tobacco products such as mental health cigarettes have been historically marketed to Black communities by tobacco companies at higher rates than white communities. Despite regulating and banning other products, the federal government did not consider banning menthol-flavored tobacco products until 2021. Additionally, the overconcentration of liquor stores in American neighborhoods is correlated to, The concentration of liquor stores in African American neighborhoods is correlated to African American health problems. The makers of sugar-sweetened beverages, fast foods, and other products also often target Black communities in marketing schemes. These food products contribute to overconsumption, leading to diabetes, obesity, and other health problems. Between 2005 and 2008, Black adults consumed nearly 9% of their daily categories from the sugar drinks, compared to about 5% for white adults. Black children and teens are more likely than their white as many aids for certain sugar drinks than their white peers. Lower-income Black neighborhoods have disproportionately more outdoor ads on billboards, bus benches, sidewalk signals, murals, and more window posters for sugar drinks. Sugar has had disproportionately negative consequences for Black people and is linked to diabetes, obesity, and hypertension. Marketing campaigns are protected by law under the First Amendment, while Black youth are not protected from the harmful consequences of their actions. Let's see. Natural disasters. The federal government has engaged in racist management of natural disasters like hurricanes. A prime example is Hurricane Katrina. Racial health disparities among Black communities in New Orleans existed prior to Hurricane Katrina. This was due to lack of health insurance for low-income residents, high levels of infant mortality, and high levels of chronic disease. Charity Hospital, a state hospital in New Orleans, had been the center of hospital care for poor African Americans prior to Hurricane Katrina. 3/4 of its patients were Black with incomes below $20,000. The hospital provided care for HIV/AIDS, drug abuse, psychiatric care, and trauma care. After the hurricane, the state did not reopen Charity Hospital, leaving poor African Americans in New Orleans without medical care. Following Hurricane Katrina, Black communities received diminished medical care that amplified health disparities, while white communities were restored to even better conditions than they had lived in before the hurricane hit. By 2010, 34% of the Black population in New Orleans was living in poverty, compared to 14% of white people. Black youth in New Orleans were 4 times more likely to die from any cause than their white counterparts. There were increased death rates for African Americans from kidney disease and HIV. From 2009 to 2011, 1/3 of Black residents lacked health insurance, double that of white Americans. The federal government directed funding to repair the buildings, bridges, and streets of New Orleans. However, the government did not address the rampant poverty and health disparities among Black people that had been exacerbated by Hurricane Katrina. Let's see here. Where am I at here? All right. Let's do this. C19. Today, African Americans are disproportionately at risk for C19 infection and death due to structural factors such as healthcare access, density of households, employment, and pervasive discrimination. As of March 2022, African Americans are 1.1 times more likely to contract C19, 2.4 times more likely to be hospitalized due to C19, and 1 times more likely to die from C19 than white Americans. The federal government suggests that long-standing racial inequities contribute to worse C19 outcomes for Black people. Factors that increase C19 risk for African Americans include unaffordable housing, lack of healthy food, environmental pollution, poor quality health care, poor health insurance, essential worker jobs, lower incomes, greater debt, and poor access to high-quality education. All of these factors disproportionately harm African Americans due to systemic racism. The state of California has also engaged in this mismanagement of public crisis in ways that have harmed African Americans. In California, the criminal justice system excessively targeted African Americans during the crack cocaine epidemic. Interjection, absolutely facts. In Los Angeles, Black Californians would receive up to a 10-year federal sentence, while white Americans prosecuted in state court faced a maximum of 5 years and often received no more than a year in jail. From 1987 to 1992, a University of California, Los Angeles study found there were no white Americans among the 71 defendants prosecuted federally by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles. The discriminatory prosecution occurred even though studies showed that white Americans accounted for the majority of people who use crack cocaine in Los Angeles. Rewind, replay. This discriminatory prosecution occurred even though studies showed that white Americans accounted for the majority of people who use crack cocaine in the City of Angels, also known as Los Angeles. As of 2017, California incarcerated African American men at 10 times the rates of white American men, resulting in devastating health impacts for the African American community. Black women are imprisoned at a rate that is more than 5 times that of white women in California. Black Californians are also overrepresented among California's unhoused. This overrepresentation of Black Californians among the unhoused and incarcerated populations, both of which are vulnerable to C19, means that Black Californians are consequently at higher risk of contracting C19 and other illnesses. California is also home to many food deserts that harm African American health. In South Los Angeles, many Black Californians do not have enough grocery stores. Word, interjection. Access to organic produce, thriving small businesses, affordable housing, or medical services. In View Park area, a majority Black South Los Angeles neighborhood, the nearest grocery store is in Albertsons more than a mile away. Black residents have been forced to engage in urban microfarming, building community gardens, and mini markets to compensate for the lack of healthy, available food. Well, you go, fam. The trifecta of liquor stores, smoke shops, and marijuana dispensaries in Black neighborhoods in California has resulted in inadequate access to healthy foods. Maria Rutledge, a Black resident of South Los Angeles, said, "We are in desperate need of a real grocery market in the area that is welcoming to families, provides healthy food choices, and that supports a safer environment." In addition to the lack of grocery stores, there is an overabundance of liquor stores. During the early 1990s, there were 728 liquor stores in a 54 square mile radius encompassing South Los Angeles. While that number has decreased, South Los Angeles communities are still overrun by liquor stores with approximately 8.5% stores per square mile compared to 1.97 liquor stores per square mile in West Los Angeles, a majority white neighborhood. The trifecta of liquor stores, smoke shops, and marijuana dispensaries in black neighborhoods have indirectly resulted in sexual harassment, violence, and a climate of fear leading to poor mental and physical health for black Californians. In California, C19 infections disproportionately affect African Americans. As of March 2022, the death rate for black Californians due to C19 is 18% higher than the C19 death toll for all Californians. According to a survey recording by the Association of Black Psychologists, about 40% of black Californians wish they had more support during the C19 pandemic. Impact of racism on black health. Systemic racism has accumulated over centuries and severely damaged psychological health for African Americans. Some scholars have argued that that medical discrimination in the United States against African Americans is so severe that it is a form of biological terrorism. Wow. Low life expectancy, lack of access to health insurance, and higher rates of disease have resulted in great psychological harm to African Americans. State-sanctioned systemic racism has led to environmental racism, urban poverty, and over-incarceration, all of which has harmed the health of African Americans. The cumulative effect of institutional racism by federal and state governments has led to racial trauma that has had integration and impacts on the mental health of African Americans. Health outcomes. African Americans have higher rates of morbidity and mortality than white Americans for almost all health outcomes in the United States. An inequality that increases with age. African Americans suffer disproportionately from cardiovascular disease relative to white people. In surveys of hospitals across the country, black patients with heart disease receive older, cheaper, and more expensive treatments than their white counterparts. They also suffer from higher rates of diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and obesity. These are all risk factors for cardiovascular disease. This is linked to the fact that African Americans suffer from weathering, constant stress from chronic exposure to social and economic disadvantage, which leads to accelerated decline in physical health. Social environments that pose a persistent threat of hostility, denigration, and disrespect lead to chronically high levels of inflammation. Studies have shown that black youth who are exposed to discrimination and segregation have worse off of adult inflammation due to race-related stressors. In fact, race-related stress has a great impact on health among African Americans in their diet, exercise, smoking, or low income. Cortisol, which is a stress hormone, locates itself in bodies in response to racism. Consequently, African American adults have fewer high rates of cortisol than their white counterparts. And this is linked to cardiovascular disease. Therefore, exposure to racism as a child or adolescent lays the foundation for humiliation and subsequent health disparities. Even middle and upper class African Americans manifest high rates of chronic illness and disability. Discriminatory attitudes and behaviors by healthcare professionals may also contribute to misdiagnosis and mismanagement of cardiovascular disease among Black patients. African Americans disproportionately lack access to renal transplants due to racial bias exhibited by physicians, as well as institutionalized racism. African Americans are less likely to be identified as transplant candidates, referred for evaluation, be put on a kidney transplant list, receive a transplant, and receive a higher quality kidney from a living donor. Black patients with sickle cell disease are discriminated against by medical providers who display racist attitudes and accuse people with sickle cell disease of faking their pain. This results in inadequate treatment. There are many reports of Black children with sickle cell, all the babies, disease who do not receive tests and treatment necessary to prevent strokes that can occur due to the disease. Racial disparities in Black health outcomes occur today as a culmination of historic racial inequality, discriminatory health policy, and persistent racial discrimination in many sectors of life in the United States. Discriminatory health systems and healthcare providers contribute to racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare. The U.S. Office for Civil Rights within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is charged with enforcing several relevant federal statutes and regulations that prohibit discrimination in healthcare, such as Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. However, the agency is under-resourced and has not been proactive in investigating healthcare-related complaints from the public. Conducting compliance reviews of healthcare facilities or initiating enforcement proceedings for civil rights violators. For example, the Office for Civil Rights could not identify examples of discriminatory practices, require the collection and reporting of demographic data, and conduct investigations. Policing and incarceration. Policing and incarceration have clear adverse consequences for the health of African Americans. Racial inequality and racial bias occurred in all aspects of the criminal legal system, with federal and state governments over-incarcerating and disproportionately punishing African Americans. For a more detailed discussion of discrimination in the criminal justice system, please see Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System. Police violence kills hundreds of African Americans and injures thousands each year. Incarcerated people who are disproportionately Black face a higher risk of death than they are released from prisons and jails due to poor health as a result of incarceration. Prisons and jails have been major sites of disease transmission. The churn in and out of incarceration can result in community spread of sexually transmitted infections or other infectious diseases. African Americans are overrepresented in state carceral facilities, are less likely to receive the latest psychiatric medications, and have greater difficulty in achieving successful community integration once they leave carceral facilities, further harming their mental health. State prisons often force incarcerated African Americans into solitary confinement at higher rates. Solitary confinement has seriously documented harmful mental health effects. Anti-Black government action harms the mental health of Black communities. Police violence can harm mental and physical health for Black communities. through constant surveillance and threats of violence. Studies have shown that African Americans who knew racist materials experience an increase in blood pressure. Scientific evidence shows that police killings of unarmed African Americans have adverse effects on mental health among Black adults in this general population. Mental health screening tools used in state and federal care facilities reproduce racial disparities, resulting in fewer African Americans screening positive for mental illness. Thus, African Americans remain under-referred and unaffected in the jail population. Environment. State and federal underfunding of medical resources combined with unhealthy physical environments, unemployment, and poverty in Black communities has led to a public health crisis. Urban neighborhoods have the highest rates of preventable disease and lack health insurance and adequate housing. By 1980, urban neighborhoods were 60% of the nation's Black population lived due to redlining and historical housing segregation. Black communities continue to experience disproportionately high rates of chronic diseases linked to environmental racism. For more detailed discussion of environmental racism, please see Chapter 7 on racism, environment, and infrastructure. Built-up population from abandoned industrial and commercial work sites resides in soil, water, structures, and air. Asthma, cancer, and childhood disorders that affect Black communities are linked to polluted environmental conditions such as toxic waste exposure and lead poisoning. All right, so let's see here. Okay, anti-Black government action harms the mental health of Black communities. Police violence can harm mental and physical health of Black communities through constant surveillance and threats of violence. Studies have shown that African Americans who view racist materials experience an increase in blood pressure. Scientific evidence shows that police killings of unarmed African Americans have adverse effects on mental health among Black adults in the general population. Mental health screening tools used in state and federal carceral facilities reproduce racial disparities, resulting in fewer African Americans screening positive for mental illness. Thus, African Americans remain under-referred and undetected in jail population. Environment. State and federal underfunding of medical resources combined with unhealthy physical environments, unemployment, and poverty in Black communities has led to a public health crisis. Urban neighborhoods have the highest rates of preventable diseases and lack health insurance and adequate housing. By 1980, urban neighborhoods were 60% of the nation's Black population lived due to redlining and historical housing segregation. Black communities continue to experience disproportionately high rates of chronic diseases linked to environmental racism. For a more detailed discussion of environmental racism, please see Chapter 7 on racism in environment and infrastructure. Built-up population from abandoned industrial and commercial work sites resides in soil, water, structure, and air. Asthma, cancer, and childhood disorders that affect Black communities are linked to polluted environmental conditions such as toxic waste exposure and lead poisoning. Segregation adversely affects availability and affordability of care, creating a lack of access to high-quality primary and specialty care, as well as pharmacy services. A review of nearly 50 empirical studies generally found that government facilitated segregation was associated with poorer health. The state perpetrated discriminatory practice of redlining officially ended in 1968, but it created residential segregation, which continues today. Segregation has been found to be positively associated with later stage diagnosis, elevated mortality, and lower survival rates for both breast and lung cancers for Black people. Housing segregation excessively exposes Black communities to population and isolate African Americans from healthcare resources and resources including pharmacies, clinics, hospitals, and healthy food services stores. Disparities in life expectancies between Black and white people are rooted in policies that oppressed and segregated African Americans. Evidence shows that gaps between white and Black life expectancy are dependent on zip codes and housing segregation. There may be other cumulative negative effects of institutional and systemic racism, which have yet to be studied by scientists. A public health study conducted in 2021, for example, revealed that repeated use of chemical irritants for crowd controlled by local and federal law enforcement during racial justice protests in the U.S. likely harmed people's mental and physical health. California. Black Californians experience the shortest life expectancy than any other race or ethnicity. In San Francisco Bay Area, life expectancy is more than 5 times greater in white neighborhoods, 84 years, than highly segregated Black neighborhoods, 79 years. Black Californians have the highest mortality rate in 9 out of the top 10 causes of death in San Francisco. A high number of Black Californians live in Southwest Fresno, an area with lower life expectancy than the affluent neighborhoods of Fresno. Black Californians suffer from the highest cancer rates among all races in colorectal, prostate, and lung cancer. Black men are dying of prostate cancer at almost 5 times the rate of white men in California. In 2015, Black Californians had the highest rate of preventable hospitalizations for diabetes, heart disease, asthma, and angina. Black youth suffer from the highest number of asthma cases in California. Black children in California tend to live in areas with higher levels of traffic-related population, which contributes to higher levels of asthma. Historically, red-line census tracts in California have significantly higher rates of emergency department visits due to asthma. This evidence suggests that redlining might be contributing to racial and ethnic asthma health disparities. Black Californians are the most disproportionately affected by HIV epidemic due to racism in part. In 2018, Black Californians were approximately 6% of California's population, but they were 18% of California's HIV positive population. Among women newly diagnosed with HIV, 31% were Black Californians. Black transgender people were for 14% of those who were newly diagnosed with HIV. Consequently, Black Californians are overrepresented among the HIV population. Police violence and incarceration have greatly damaged the health of Black Californians. Black Californians account for 20% of serious injuries and fatalities due to police use of force, even though they are only 6% of the population. More than 4 in 10 Californians shot by police were identified as suffering from a mental health condition, having an alcohol or drug-related disorder or both, according to hospital data. In Brown versus Plata, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ordered the state of California to reduce overcrowding in its prison population due to inadequate health care for incarcerated people. Black Californians in Los Angeles' jails who have mental health conditions report receiving harsher sentences and less alternative treatment programs than their white counterparts. Due to the overrepresentation of Black Californians in the prison and jail system, inadequate prison health care greatly diminishes the overall health of Black Californians. Conclusion. The legacy of slavery has destroyed the health of Black communities through segregation, racial terror, abusive experimentation, systemic racist oppression, and harmful racist neglect. Today, African Americans face racial discrimination from healthcare providers across the entire healthcare system, which has contributed to the overall destruction of African American health. African Americans suffer from low life expectancy and high mortality rates across virtually every category of health. Due to historical and contemporary traumatization from racist violence, racist microaggressions, and institutional racism, African Americans often suffer from serious psychological distress. This mismanagement of public health crisis by state and federal governments has resulted in additional adverse health consequences and deaths in Black communities. Most recently during the C-19 pandemic, in some cases, the racial health disparities between Black and white Americans are worse today than they were during the period of enslavement. The racist dehumanization of African Americans in the United States began with the institution of enslavement and its degradation of African American health. Since then, this racist dehumanization has been sustained by a healthcare system that destroys Black health through overt and covert discrimination by medical providers, public policies that neglect African Americans' health needs, hospital systems that continue to be segregated, medical schools that systemically exclude African Americans, and a health insurance system designed to be inaccessible to poor African Americans. The United States healthcare system was designed during the time of enslavement to keep enslaved people alive for profit, but not to take care of their health. After slavery was abolished in name, this healthcare system continued to operate in the same manner, segregating, excluding, harming, abusing, experimenting upon, and slowly degrading African American health. To atone for the violence of slavery and its destructive impact on Black health, health-based reparations must be awarded to African Americans. Can I get an amen? All right. Whew, man, this is heavy. All right, that was chapter 12, family. Chapter 13. Wow, can you believe it, family? We're almost there to the finish line. The wealth gap. The wealth gap. Show me the money. Reparations now. Show me the money. I can't remember what that movie was called, but who was it? Cuba Gooding Jr. was in there. He was talking about show me the money. All right, family. Thank you for joining. We're gonna wrap it up now. I appreciate you, Darlene. Man, shout out to Darlene, man. You such a trooper. Darlene is a trooper. I tell you what. And thanks, Mr. Black ADLs, for coming through. Yeah, so we're going to do this again. Chapter 13 tomorrow. Last one. Please be in the building. We're going to talk about the wealth gap, the egregious wealth gap that still persists, especially between, Black and white Americans. Still to this day. So we're going to see if, they talk about what the wealth gap is and, what California and what the federal government, the United States, needs to do to close that racial wealth gap. All right, fam. Y'all have a good one. Love, peace, and reparations. Until then, stay safe, fam. Be blessed. And on that note, we are out.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people. Look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I gotta show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.